Good morning, everyone. I'm going to get started. I figure people are still figuring out where they're going, but I'm going to get started so we can make the most of the time. My name is Vandine Campbell. I'm an assistant research professor at Rutgers University in Newark, where I spend most of my time at the Cornwall Center, the Joseph C. Cornwall Center for Metropolitan Studies. I've been spending the last few years researching various aspects of school improvement, focusing quite a bit on the middle to high school and high school to college transition and various issues along that pathway, both looking at issues and opportunities. And I also study parental engagement and how the culture and climate at the school interacts or affects the extent to which parents can be engaged in their children's education. So that's kind of the scope of my research. Today I will be, I'll be presenting about school resources and climate in high schools in New Jersey through the lens of segregation. I think broadly about school resources, including things like the curriculum, staff, resources to support student success. This presentation won't go into fiscal resources per se, but we all know that for any one thing we talk about, there's a fiscal question behind it. But I won't cover that today. I would say the organizing question for my presentation is as follows. What missed opportunities or potholes for student success are apparent in New Jersey's data? And pardon me, there will be a lot of data, but they invited me to let the data speak. So I will be walking through quite a bit of the statewide data that I've been looking at over the past couple of years. All data are at the school level, and all data are from the New Jersey Department of Education's public data resources that I've reworked to tell the story that I'm telling today. Just to give a brief overview, I spent quite a bit of the presentation talking about curricular breadth, that aspect of school resources, and focusing in particular on STEM access, science, technology, education, and mathematics, acknowledging that there are many other curricular areas that are really important, but in a 50 or so minute presentation, I've decided to focus on the STEM opportunities, and hopefully in future research I'll be able to dig into other curricular areas. I then talk a little bit about resources for student support, particularly student to staff ratios, and question a little bit what the data might mean for the extent to which students are supported in schools. I pull a few measures on school climate. Obviously, school climate is typically measured through surveys and asking folks in the school what they think and what they're experiencing. You'll find that the work I'm doing right now is really just looking at what we can find out from the data that's already available. And so I've pulled a couple of measures of school climate here: chronic absenteeism and incidents in schools, which I'll define later, just briefly. And then finally, I look at a few things related to the staff, namely teacher attendance and teacher retention. There are a lot more metrics available, which I'll briefly mention, but again, the bulk of the presentation will be on the curricular resources in school. Oh, and then towards the end, I have a few questions for discussion, so I'll try to get through as much of the data as I can quickly, so we have some time to hear and to have a discussion about what we're seeing. All right. So why STEM? STEM access is a national priority, as we all probably know, for global competitiveness. We know that actually accessing STEM majors is less of an issue, although there are disparities there, but part of the larger issue is persisting in STEM majors when students get to college. And some of the research is telling us that that persistence is linked to earlier experiences in middle school and high school. We also know that there is disproportionate participation in STEM fields, so that 9% and looking at Black and Latinx workers, 9% and 8% of STEM workers versus 11% and 17% of their share of employed adults. So there's some disproportion there in participation. And we also know that STEM in particular is an opportunity for boosting wages. Some of the careers with the highest wages nationally are STEM careers. And so when we think about labor outcomes, when we think about moving large numbers of people of color to the middle class, STEM is really an opportunity to do that. So just digging a little bit deeper, what does this mean? Why do we look at some of these things? I took some time to do a scan of some of our local universities. I don't know if anybody here is representing any of these universities. Just looking at their admissions criteria for a handful of STEM majors. And I would say, in a nutshell, courses like biology and chemistry can, of course, take you a far way in meeting that criteria. But when we're looking at other majors like engineering, architecture, and so forth, there's this additional requirement to go further for more advanced science course taking, such as physics and advanced placement courses. So the point here is that for access to some of these majors, students are needing to go a little bit further in the science course taken sequence beyond biology and chemistry. And so we keep that in the backdrop as I move into some of the data I will be showing today. I want to put this up front, although it's more towards the implications and call to action, but I want to make sure that this is featured up front. I really like this STEM framework for success that the STEM Opportunity Index, an organization that coordinates across school districts and various organizations looking to promote STEM participation. You probably can't see the image here, so I've highlighted a few points related to the school context and learning opportunities around STEM. Such as, schools creating STEM learning opportunities guided by strong leadership, clear, coherent vision for instruction, having a school culture that promotes curiosity, experimentation, inquiry, and continued growth, STEM-focused teacher collaboration built into the regular school day, and having advanced offerings and inclusive enrollment practices in those offerings. So we know sometimes, even when courses are offered, there are disparities in who are actually enrolled in the courses. Coherent curriculum materials and opportunities for students to engage with STEM-rich institutions and boosting that STEM identity, which again, we know is linked to persistence in STEM majors later on. Capitalizing on students' interests and experiences. We've heard some of these themes in the introductory sessions, but really incorporating the capital that students bring to the table and incorporating that into the curriculum and the experiences. And finally, student learning bolstered by strong connections between schools, between students and their families. So I just want to have that up front as we go into the data. So just a quick backdrop here. As I said before, all the data that I look at kind of breaks down the differences that we're seeing statewide across segregation categories. I focus on 3 categories of school segregation: schools that are mixed or, by some measure considered non-segregated. Then I look at schools that are segregated by both economics and racially, and then schools that are segregated economically. You'll see in the note at the bottom that there's some other categories in the data that I look at or that we've been working with, but really these categories capture the majority of high schools in New Jersey. All right, so let's look at clarity. Okay, so starting with science course enrollment, and again, thinking about this as a resource, what I'm seeing in the data is that if you look at the far right panel, I guess your left, segregated schools, schools that are segregated both racially and economically. What we're seeing is that in 9th grade, freshman year, there's a tendency for students to be enrolled in environmental science versus biology. So I put some notes to hopefully guide you through looking through these graphs. Whereas in schools that are more racially and economically mixed, there's a standard pattern of starting with biology in 9th grade, so that the difference is 31 percentage points as of 2019-20. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to just go through a sequence of course taking in science. Here we're looking at the 10th grade pattern, enrollment pattern in science courses. Science courses are identifiable in the data. We're seeing that standard sequence, that biology, chemistry, physics sequence is apparent, but less apparent in schools that are most segregated. And so there's this 13 percentage point difference in students enrolling in chemistry in 10th grade. What we're seeing instead is that there's a tendency in some of the most segregated schools for students to be taking biology in 10th grade instead of in 9th grade. And I'll play that out a little bit so that by 11th grade, what we see over here is that in the mixed enrollment schools, there's a far greater likelihood for students to be taking physics, right? Whereas if we look at the most segregated schools on the other end, you see that concentration in 11th grade in biology and chemistry, right? So that advantage that started out 9th grade is kind of building up and widening, you know, as students go through the high school trajectory. And then and just to highlight this, so 75%, about 75% of students in the most segregated schools are taking biology and chemistry in 11th grade, and the band for physics is much smaller as compared to mixed schools. Now play this out through 12th grade, where science course taken overall just drops, right, across the board. But drops even further in the two most segregated school categories. My conclusion here is that there appears to be no point in this sequence from this data at which those gaps established in 9th grade where they get closed, right? So at no point do I see a higher tendency for students in the most segregated schools to be taking physics, right? Because that yellow band pretty much stays fairly narrow right throughout, whereas beginning in 11th grade and 12th grade, it's fairly wide in the economically mixed schools, right? So one of the things that we do in our analysis is kind of identify schools that are considered segregated that we observe a different pattern for those schools. So schools that seem to be maintaining high levels of standard to advanced science course taking. One such school is Dover High School. So I've highlighted their trends here. What we hope to do later this year is to really dig a little bit deeper into what we're learning from some of these schools. And in the session earlier, I was happy to hear some other schools locally highlighted, and we see those schools in the data as well. So what we're hoping to do is to learn about the practices happening there, the policies that those schools are maintaining, and you know, so that we can kind of translate some of that knowledge more broadly. I think I'm okay with interruptions if you have a question along the way, but otherwise I'll just proceed. I look a little bit as well on math course taking, so that the math sequence. What we're seeing here, and just to contextualize it, there's some controversy about early access to Algebra 1, so taking Algebra 1 in 7th or 8th grade. Many would argue that most students are just not academically prepared to take the course earlier, regardless of where you go to school. But others would argue that for the students who are academically prepared, they should have the opportunity to do so and therefore get ahead a little bit on the math course taken sequence, right? So, you know, the argument really lies in instructional approaches, in the K-5 preparedness, and so there's a lot there that cannot be ignored. But what I argue is that if there are schools that are being advantaged by this opportunity, then it should be equitably distributed. And so, you know, while the argument about preparation is very important, the fact that Algebra 1 in middle school is less likely, far less likely, to be offered in segregated schools, for me, is a major equity issue. Here, we're seeing a 40 percentage point difference between segregated, so the bottom line, most segregated and mixed enrollment schools, in the percent of schools offering Algebra 1 in the middle grades.
Did you find that those who are taking Algebra 1 are in honors classes?
So one of the limitations of this data is that I'm taking the school level data, I'm looking at enrollment patterns, and I'm just painting this picture, right? I've not yet gotten the data to look at student level to then see what students are taking.
I'm just wondering,
yeah.
Is that, like, because that is where they're kind of placing Algebra 1
yeah.
into like an honors.
Yeah.
You know, that's what actually I experienced. But what they did in my middle school, they did honors, English, and math together. So I struggled in math because I wasn't good. But in order to take honors English, I had to take honors math.
Right.
And that's where they offered Algebra 1.
Yeah.
So
okay.
all the other students who were in honors did not get it, which is like what this is seeing.
Right.
Which is
right.
insane. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it puts you back so far.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that, though, because I'm noting it for when I'm looking at other data.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's really good.
Okay. So what the sequence of charts following this one will show is that, you know, obviously with these data, you can't really make the conclusion that what you're seeing here is causing everything else down the line, but the gap that starts here kind of just remains right throughout, right? So what I'm particularly calling attention to in the series of math charts that I show is the extent to which we see evidence that there are at least some students, some proportion of students that are a little bit ahead of the standard sequence of Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, then Pre-Cal, right? We're looking to see if, as we observe in mixed schools, if the same is true for segregated schools. And what we're seeing is that in the segregated schools, right, the tendency is toward a standard math sequence, which is fine, right? You know, anecdote, I was pushing my daughter to take Algebra 1 in 8th grade. I told her, you know, I could you know, probably help her get some tutoring to be ready. And she said, no, I don't want to take it. I just want to stay on the standard sequence. I don't want to be advanced in math. I like this, right? And that was fine. But the issue I'm pointing to here is the fact that there's an equity gap, right? There's a gap here, and where the opportunity is in one place, or the tendency is in one place, then, you know, why not in the other place, right? So, no idea what you're seeing, actually. So I'm pointing, but you're not seeing my pointer. But over here, looking at the racially and economically mixed schools, what we're seeing is an 11 percentage point difference in the percent of school students taking geometry in 9th grade right? Whereas there is that, you know, some students in segregated schools are taking geometry in ninth grade. So we do see that happening, which I mentioned later is encouraging. But you see that larger gap when you're comparing the two. So again, the point is that there's a tendency for a more standard sequence, whereas in mixed schools, substantial percentage of students are a little bit ahead in the sequence, and that advantages them later. So just playing that out now. Now I'm at 10th grade, right? Looking at the percent who are now taking Algebra 2 in 10th grade, you see that 10 or 11 percentage point gap just kind of sticking right through. If you follow that arrow over here. And then looking at 11th grade, now standard would have been, standard in 11th grade, I'm sorry, being a little bit ahead would be taking pre-calculus in 11th grade, right? And so we're seeing again that percentage difference. In the mixed schools, 26% taking pre-calculus. In segregated schools, 16% taking pre-calculus. Again, it's happening and that's good, but we're looking at the disparity between the two. And then finally, in 12th grade, when again math course taking drops a bit, drops across the board, it drops even more in segregated schools. Some of you may be aware of the literature that says that taking a 4th year of math tends to be beneficial, you know, for students when they enroll in college. And so some policies kind of push that 4th year of math. It's not necessarily required by graduation standards in the state, but you know, it would be a school policy to kind of push this. But anyway, we see that math course taking overall drops, but drops more in segregated schools. And then what we're looking at here as well is that gap in students getting to calculus by 12th grade, which is more likely to happen when students have taken Algebra 1 a little bit earlier, right? It's harder for them to get to, it's not impossible. They're you know, their policies and approaches that can allow students to participate in a more advanced sequence even when they haven't taken Algebra 1 earlier. But we see that gap here. So that 8% of students take calculus in 12th grade in segregated schools compared to 25% in mixed schools. If we look at calculus, if we look at pre-calculus, calculus, and statistics together, thinking of those all together as more advanced, I think the verdict is still out on whether statistics is advanced or not, but it's you know, kind of grouped together here. We see 35% in segregated schools taking one of those 3 courses compared to 60% in mixed schools taking one of those 3 courses senior year. Thinking again about other aspects of curricular resources in school, I looked a bit at the availability of various AP Math and Computer Science courses and AP Science courses. I know usually it's reported as the percent of students taking 1 or more AP courses. I have that later, but I've started to look specifically at the courses being offered and the enrollment in those courses because I'm trying to ask of the data, what are the opportunities, concrete opportunities that we can tackle or approach in schools. And so I'm aiming to go a little bit deeper to paint a picture of where those leverage points could be. So looking at AP Computer Science and Math courses, if you just follow that gray line at the bottom that represents segregated schools and the orange line represents non-segregated schools, you'll see those huge gaps in some subjects, not so large in others, but well, I would say AP Computer Science Principles probably has the smallest gap, but across the board, you see those gaps larger than 50 percentage points, right? In some cases, you see patterns where the gap was closing and then it widened back, right? Such as with AP Calculus AB. I wish my pointer was showing on the screen, but I'm not going to mess anything up right now. So this is AP Computer Science and Math. Now looking at AP Science courses, we see a similar pattern, but higher rates of offering courses like AP Biology, even in segregated schools, and AP Chemistry. But again, we're thinking equity, we're thinking about the gap, right? We're thinking about where are the opportunities to close gaps in curricular experiences, in curricular breadth, to prepare students for good, rewarding post-secondary opportunities. Now, what I want to point out on this slide is how the gap in enrollment, taking exam, and earning scores on these exams that would be college recognized on average. Colleges have different policies for what they recognize. How it kind of narrows. So one of the arguments that you hear sometimes when you present this data is, and there's research that say this, but one of the arguments that you hear often, well, you offer the course, students are not going to do well. I think, this reducing gap between enrollment or you hear the argument that they won't take the exams, right? I think this reducing gap from enrolling in the courses to, earning college recognized scores kind of begin to tell us something about what's possible, right? In other words, the gap in for example, taking the exam, it's much smaller, well, not much smaller, but it's a little smaller than the gap in enrolling in courses. And then the gap in earning college-ready scores is even a little bit smaller. So for me, that tells us a bit about what's possible. And in some of the reports, we go into the research that talks about strategies, school-based strategies that can really, be used to support students to be successful in the courses.
Again, what's the definition of those considered a mixed school, non-segregated, economically segregated?
Right. So, and I went quickly through that slide.
Oh, okay.
So, mixed would be between 10% and 90% white, white, and less than 50% economic disadvantage, right? So, arguably a more racial mix, but as we heard earlier, sometimes that 75% cut point also gives you
racially mixed is, what is that,
10 to 90%, right? Or over 10, less than 90% to be more specific. And then segregated racially and by economic disadvantage would be 90% or more students of color, and then 50% or more economical disadvantage. In New Jersey, in New Jersey's data, that shows up to be majority Black and Latinx students, although you do have a handful of schools that have like a mix of Latinx and Asian or Black, and you get the point. But overwhelmingly Black and Latinx students making up that students of color category. And then the schools that are segregated economically are racially mixed schools, right? But they have 50% or more economic disadvantage. So, yeah, like Clifton, like schools like that, yeah. Districts like that. And this is school level, not district level. All right. And then I look a bit at dual enrollment as another aspect of curricular resources, What's nice is that the rates of participation, which I imagine would correlate to the rates of offering, dual enrollment does increase pretty dramatically across the board and in segregated schools. But again, we see the gap, 26% compared to 11% of 11th and 12th graders enrolling in one or more dual enrollment course. So taking college courses while they are in high school. And I'm aware of a lot of recent effort to really change this, which is good and important, but what I'm doing here is just really painting the picture of what we're seeing in the data. I look too at career and technical education, opportunities to be participating in sequences of courses that can lead to industry certification in particular areas that translate well into college admissions. The research says that, in participating in CTE, students have a higher likelihood of enrolling in college and pursuing fields in those areas that they started in high school. One of those paths that you can almost count on, and especially in some of the more competitive fields. What you're looking at is the rate of students that are participating, right? So taking one or more CTE course. And I have other data that look into the specific courses. What I see here is that the gap in participation is actually less pronounced and tends to be higher in schools that are segregated. Sorry, not the gap. The percentage participating tends to be higher in schools segregated economically, so that middle blue bar, right? But then when we get to concentrating, so that's taking two or more courses in the same field of study, right? So that's the pathway that would lead to an industry certification. We see that the numbers start to look different. Economically segregated schools still having the highest rates of concentrating in a CTE course of study. But in the racially and economically segregated schools, rates of concentrating tracks lower than rates of participating, and that gap between those schools and the other categories, both economically segregated and mixed schools, kind of widen when we're looking at concentrating in CTE courses of study. All right, so shifting out of curricular resources and just looking briefly at other aspects of school resources. I look at school resources for student support. And I zoom in a bit on school counselors. We heard that mentioned in the earlier session in different ways, in that I think one of the young persons said that what they were hearing from their counselor wasn't particularly encouraging. And there's research about high quality counselors that are not high quality, but just to zoom in on some important points here. For example, in the second point, students of color and students from low income families are more likely to identify school counselors as the person who had the most influence on their thinking about post-secondary education. This is citing some research from EdTrust in 2019. The American School Counselor Association recommends a ratio of 250 students per counselor.
I mean, that's insane.
Well, you'll see the numbers, and then we'll call back that term. That's insane. Importantly, ASCA also recommends that school counselors spend at least 80% of their time either working directly with students or indirectly for students. And we know one of the narratives that we've been hearing just out and about is that, you know, a lot of staff for student support are being pulled to, you know, do things like manage the cafeteria or, you know, recess and so forth. But importantly, the counselors are supposed to be working with students or for students. So, you know, this resource is just one of many important parts of ensuring educational success, and particularly post-secondary success when we're looking at the high schools, which is where all this data is focused. Now, we've looked at a few different student to staff ratios. The student to teacher ratio, there's a difference, but not much disparity there. But zooming in on the student to counselor ratio, for school segregated, high school segregated racially and economically, the difference, right, is 141 more students per counselor. So the whole state is already above the, on average, above the recommended level. But then in schools needing counselors probably the most, we're seeing that those counselors have the highest ratios and are likely carrying a much higher demand and burden to be able to help, you know, really support students with their post-secondary planning and other important things such as making healthy behavioral choices. Shifting a bit to those teacher measures, which I've kind of framed as some kind of indication of commitment in students' learning environments. I look at teacher attendance rates. This disparity is not that big, but when we break it down to what that might mean for how many school days are really being missed because of attendance rates, we're looking at, looking at playing out these numbers. Teachers are coming to school about 7 fewer days on average in segregated schools compared to mixed schools. The way I'm thinking about these numbers is, and we'll look at them in conjunction with some other numbers, we're already looking at some gaps in curricular breadth, and then you're compounding this with slightly lower rates of teacher attendance. For me, this begins to put together a picture of some of the challenges in how resources are kind of playing out in high schools. Looking at teacher retention rates as well, again, the gap is not as large, though it's there, 3 percentage point difference, right? But then play that out over a few hundred teachers, you begin to feel it, right? When you're trying to accomplish something in the school. I have data on some other measures, such as education level of teachers and administrators, years of experience. The gap on some of those measures tend to be much smaller, and in some cases, actually, in economically segregated schools, administrators tend to be there longer. I'd be curious to know what that translates to on the ground. So I don't feature those numbers as much, but it's important to know that in some of those other resource metrics, less disparity, which is a good thing. All right, so shifting briefly to what might be considered some indicators of school climate. So how does it feel to be in the schools? I pulled 2 indicators here. Percentage of students chronically absent by grade level. So chronically absent would be missing about 10% or more of the school year. I think in a 180-day school year, that's missing about 18 days or more. And what we're seeing, just looking at this by grade level, 12th graders, seniors, in segregated schools, look at that gap compared to 12th graders in mixed schools. I know it's a norm for students to start falling off by 12th grade, regardless, especially if they've met their requirements. But that gap, for me, would translate into a sense of disengagement in the school environment. And then it's higher for all the other grades, 9 to 12. Interestingly, when we look at it by student groups, right? So what's interesting about this, for example, is that you can see this is one of the few data points that they provide by student groups, right? Much of the data you can't really break down to student groups. So you can't look at, for example, black students in a mixed school compared to black students in a segregated school, right? But this is one of the few data points that's provided this way, and so you can look at the differential experiences across the school types, and we're seeing that comparing, let's look, for example, at the experiences of black students in terms of being chronically absent. I didn't put here the rates of white students. I probably should have, but it is higher than the rates of white students in mixed schools, for example, and just across the board. So then if we look at students with disabilities, that's where you really see the highest rates of chronic absenteeism.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Dr. Campbell, you indicated that for this one, you were able to aggregate by ethnicity. Why is it not available in the other data?
Right, so much of the data doesn't tell you the rates for specific student groups. There are a handful of metrics that do. For example, high school graduation, college enrollment. You can look at differential rates for student groups, attendance. But for example, the course enrollment data, I can't tell the percent of black students taking physics, for example. In which case, if I had that data, then I could say, okay, this is how our black students, for example, are doing in mixed schools, and this is how they're doing in segregated schools. So data like that, the public state data does not break them down by student group, but other data points have it broken down. But for this presentation, I focused on measures that I think could get us at some of the mechanisms in schools and not so much on the outcomes, like graduation rates, college enrollment, and so forth. Here I'm trying to put together a picture of what we can say about resource availability in schools. All right. I won't spend too much time on this, but I did just pull data on incidents reported per 100 students enrolled. Incidents would include reports of violence, weapons, vandalism, substance use, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And to be honest, in other data, when you break it down by these different categories, it varies. For example, harassment, intimidation, and bullying tends to be much higher in mixed schools than in segregated schools. Substance use as well tends to be much higher in mixed schools than segregated schools. But then with some of these other categories, it just looks differently. Put less stock in some of these data because I've heard stories about how they're reported, which I don't understand. Yes?
I have a question about the racially segregated schools. So if many of the schools are predominantly, let's say suburban or they're predominantly white, are you calculating them as racially segregated?
No. Right now they are in the mixed schools. Actually, if they're predominantly white, there's another category called white isolated that I don't feature it's in the data. We've created it and we look at it. So they're actually not in mixed, but I I didn't feature it in this data. There are 7 high schools that are white isolated.
Wow.
Many more elementary and middle schools that are white isolated, but high schools, there are 7 high schools that are white isolated. Pardon me? In the state, yeah.
Wow.
What percentage is considered isolated?
So it would be 90% or more white. That would be white isolated.
I'm surprised there's only 7.
Well, I make the distinction between high schools and then the elementary. There are several more elementary and middle schools, but all these data are looking at high schools. Then there are actually 7 racially segregated schools that are not economically segregated as well.
So let's say like in Essex County, Milburn, are they considered racially?
Milburn, I mean, I don't know for sure because I have, but my guess, having been from, my guess is that it would probably be, well, it may not be because they have a growing Asian population, but they could be white isolated. I don't know if it gets up to being above 10%. They might be white isolated still. I know up to a few years ago they would have been, but I know there's an Asian population there.
But of the 7 white isolated, none of them are economically disadvantaged.
We have a category for white isolated and economically disadvantaged, and there's 0 high schools.
What?
Yeah,
Yes.
there are high schools.
Not one.
There are a handful of elementary and middle schools that would fit that category, particularly in the South, like South. Yeah.
That's why you can look at our data and people say, like, North Jersey gets a lot of funding. North Jersey does get a lot of funding, but not towards black and brown communities.
Yeah. Yeah, the funding, I leave it to the Ed Law Center people to look at.
But this is how they get their funding. Yeah, that's what's interesting. They broke down the graduation and the things that they can use in their advantage. Like, our white students are graduating more, so we need these type of resources.
I'm sorry, but the funding formula has nothing to do with graduation rates.
No, that was something different I pointed out about how they're taking the data.
But I'm sorry, I thought you made a correlation between funding.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, these are just my observations about the
For
data
me,
in general.
For me, the question, you know, and I really don't, I'm not an expert on the funding formula or any of that, but for me, part of the conversation I want to see with these data is for funding that is available, particularly with the influx of funding with ESSER monies, what if this could be addressed with some of that funding? But yeah, I am not an expert in the funding formula and, you know, what that means in light of these data. I spend more time looking at what's happening in schools and where the opportunities for school policy, for school culture to change, expectations. I see some of the curricular disparities as issues of expectation. You know, why is the course not offered? I heard earlier and know from the research that the question of preparation is a big one. But what does that mean for what needs to happen K-5, K-8, or K-7 for students to be ready, you know, for you know, some of these opportunities? Or what does that mean for high school policy? One of the things that I heard earlier that I have read in the research is that there's this, okay, you're not ready, let's get you ready and let's get you in these advanced courses before you leave us in 12th grade. So, you know, that's kind of where my focus is at, yeah. And then I listen to the funding people and try to understand it, but it's not my area. So, what am I doing with time? Just a quick recap. You know, for points that I'm hoping will resonate. There are great disparities in what I consider to be STEM pathways that seem very actionable in real time. And so really do hope that that point resonates. One such leverage point would be the courses to which students have access and enrollment policies and preparation policies that could help them to take advantage of those courses. And then the point about counselors as a key support, key way to support student success, that stands out to me greatly in these data, especially knowing the important role of counselors. We could talk a bit about the child study ratio, but that there's less disparity there. But the student counselor ratio really stands out to me as an area in need of attention. So I turn it back to you, the audience. Put up here a few questions that I think could kind of start a discussion, and I'm really glad to hear that there are note takers in each of the panels. I don't know who's the note taker here. But from your perspective, what are some of the issues underlying the trends that we see in course availability, course enrollment? Is this data real? Is what I'm seeing in these school level data that's put on the website, is that what you see in schools? Can never ever fully tell how accurate the data are. So it's always good to hear what people are experiencing or are seeing on the ground. What's at stake in what we're seeing? Are there other paths that students are pursuing, or is there something really big at stake here with STEM access? I see it as a big issue, just knowing the benefits when you play it out to career level and wages. But I always like to hear from practitioners so I can get out of my head a little bit and out of reading papers. And then, this is a big one for me. What is the role of district, school, and or state policy? Sometimes it's hard to tell at which level does this really get changed, right? The graduation rate, the graduation requirements are the graduation requirements. They're, in my opinion, just looking at graduation requirements, naturally they're reasonable. 3 years of science, 3 years of math, and there's some stipulations about what science and what math, but there's room in there for students to fall into a completely lower level sequence. So I don't know. So the question to you is, where's the lever, or what are the levers for changing some of this, and what resources can be leveraged to change some of the trends that we are observing? I'll leave it there. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you began your presentation by saying, we can't touch, or you weren't going to touch on the fiscal question, but that's kind of what comes up here, because obviously addressing these inequities is going to take massive amounts of resources, and that's going to take, it brings up questions of movement and class power, and it's clearly the capitalists don't want to invest in social reproduction in this country. If you look at STEM, I just did a quick Google search, 40% of STEM workers in the United States are immigrants. So the US capitalists have decided they can engage in the brain drain around the world, particularly the global south, rather than reinvesting in social reproduction, of which, yes, schools are a major part. And so that's going to take a huge kind of movement. That's really what's going to, where the resources, they're there, obviously. They got 50 billion, there's billions they're sending to tear apart Ukraine and Russia, but they can't find money for school counselors in New Jersey or wherever the case is. Mm-hmm. So that's...
yeah. Part of what I want to hear from folks who are in and around school and school policy is a question of is it a question of not being able to find money for school counselors, for example, or is it a question of choosing to use available resources on one thing versus another thing? So that makes it a question of decisions made either at the district level or the school level. And this is statewide, by the way.
Divide up the pie a little bit differently, but I mean, less for the cops, get the cops out of the schools. There were demands for that with the uprisings.
Yeah.
But I think just dividing up the pie a little bit differently, of taking it bureaucratically, a bureaucratic focus, is not going to really address the crisis that you're analyzing.
Oh, I should say identify yourself as well.
I'm sorry, I'm Dr. Deanna Ledford. I'm superintendent of Roseville Community Charter School here in Newark. I can tell you that it's not for lack of money, but there has to be a discussion about things like this, and there needs to be a shift in the paradigm. What's important, what's not important. I think you touched upon it. We're saying, thinking about splitting up the pie differently. But there has to be an awareness that conversations, like I think you mentioned with your children, I've had the experience with my daughters who are very, very good at math and science, but were, I can still remember a school counselor asking my older daughter, who now has her doctorate, she's a psychologist herself, wouldn't you rather get an A in the gen ed course as opposed to a B in the honors course? So stick with the general course. And when she came home and told me that, I said, well, what you're going to respond with is that you'd rather get an A in the honors course because you're fully capable, right? So, but that conversation didn't just happen with my daughter, it's happened with plenty of children, right? So, and I don't think that counselor was meaning or intending to leave that kind of a negative experience behind, right?
Right, yeah.
So I think that there needs to be a lot more discussion about systematic disparities that exist in our belief system and just the access to resources. That would be
and just to highlight, systematic disparities in belief systems, you said, yes.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes. I'm gonna get some other folks.
So my question, I know when I looked at
identify.
visiting incarcerators, I noticed that like the disparity, like at fourth grade, when you have a fourth grade test scores, it is not as large, let's say in math, and it just, the gap just keeps widening. So, and then I have a friend who told me her daughter was taking algebra in 6th grade in Montclair. So I'm like, 6th grade in Montclair?
Yeah.
Like, you're thinking you're doing something if you get your kid in algebra in 8th grade.
Right,
And I'm saying, like, maybe part of the solution is the preparation of the kids early enough.
Yeah.
So that by the time they get to high school, the teachers actually can teach that level of training. I just think in terms of where we can think about some places to put the resources, I think, early.
Yeah.
DC, NAACP. I was wondering, when you say counselors, right? Does that include the substance abuse counselors and all that?
I'm not sure like how broad the DOE definition goes, right? I would assume so, but I know for sure a big part of it would be school counselors around post-secondary planning. But that link that I provided in the slide takes you to like a list of roles for like high school counselors. And maybe the superintendent can fill in here, but it's not just post-secondary planning. A lot of it is around mental health and behavioral choices and all those things. I don't know for sure how much those roles differentiate in high schools, to be honest.
Probably need guidance counselors and school counselors.
Yeah. I know.
Hi, my name is Bernicia Hicks. I'm the director for TRIO Initiatives at Rutgers University Newark. So like others said about having access to these resources, I think taking a step further and really understanding what these resources are, right? So I think about the fact that me doing TRIO programs and I'm in 3 school districts, and for them, they think that we're only going to take students that are getting a GPA of 3.0 or higher. However, our grant that's through the Department of Education states that we're supposed to serve students that are failing, right? And what does that look like? What does that look like when we're saying, hey, we're not here to add extra work to you, we're here to, if you need FAFSA help, we're gonna do the FAFSA help with the parents and the students. All we need is a space, right? But when you're burnt out, right, because even looking at your numbers, this is before the pandemic. So we were already having issues prior to the pandemic of teachers not wanting to come, you know, the absentee level. At what point did we not see that and start addressing it? And now we're just gonna label it's the pandemic, right? As to why all these things are happening. This was happening prior to the pandemic, right? I think about, and I'm passionate about this. I remember going to school in North. Rutgers North didn't come and say, hey, you want to be a part of this program? No, so now that there are programs that are free, what are we doing to leverage that? Why are we only putting it in the magnet school? Right? Why are we not having these conversations and saying, hey, you can Google pre-college programs in the area. Hey, NJIT, I don't have a pre-college program. What does that look like for us to have an internet? For you to come out into our schools? Right? Like, there's the funding is there. I don't think funding is an issue. I think we really need to tap into these resources and not try to limit ourselves and say, oh, well, I think, let them tell you no. You don't go and say, oh, well, I don't think my kids will. You don't know that.
Yeah. And so you didn't identify, can you identify your...
J Arena, Newark education workers, they were leading the fight against the privatization and sell-off of the Newark district of the charter schools, and a member of the Professional Staff Congress Union, and I teach at CUNY.
Okay.
I mean, you did emphasize, which I think is very powerful, a key factor in kids going to college is having counselors, especially for low-income kids. In Newark, the fiscal crisis, a major part is charterization. They suck off a huge, increasingly chunk of the budget, and they have to cut. And where do they cut often? Services like counselors. And so if you're gonna, I know the mayor, even though he arose to power on the movement against the charters, doesn't seem to want to talk about it since he was elected. That has to be put front and center. We need more resources, obviously, and the privatization intensifies the fiscal crisis that districts like Newark face.
And I just wanted to, Dr. Ledford again.
I got you.
So I have been an educator for 30 plus years, but I've been in local public school districts and only came to the charter world about 4 years ago in this capacity. I'm a public charter, and there are differences.
Yes.
So I just wanted to make it clear that there are those of us who are public schools who are really just servicing communities, making sure that all children have a quality education. Then there are charters who are, like the gentleman was saying, you know, maybe fit that category, but we're not a corporation, we're not a conglomerate. We are a local public school who is servicing the children of Newark and doing it well. So I just wanted to just make it clear that I think also that information gap is wide also. And we need to take deeper dives into understanding what every individual school is doing, and that we're not all funneling money off of it. I had to learn it too. So I had the same opinion because I taught in Newark, I taught in Montclair, I was a vice principal in Homedale. I've been around, so I know what the philosophy is or what the thinking is about charters, but I didn't realize that there are differences with regard to that as well. So I think we should all just be very careful about generalizations, and we need to really just take deeper dives into understanding what institutes of learning are actually doing, and how we're doing it. So money is not the issue. I'm going to say it again. Money is not the issue, I can assure you. It's the systematic belief system, and it's the buy-in that all children have a right for quality education. And we can get past the minutia. We can actually get to the point of educating children well.
We just have time for one last question. Sure, and then I'll get to the young lady here, and then we're way past time. I want to get to the, yeah. Yes, go ahead. Are you going ahead?
Yeah, well, I mean, the fact is, whatever name you go under your school, your budget comes from the Newark Public School District. 90%, well, That's how the chart will.
That's what I'm saying. You don't really know
90%
my
per
school.
capita, they have to hand fork over to the charge for every student.
It's the
you
same
enroll.
money, whether they're educated
Well,
in the
it's,
school now.
you operate the same
All
way.
public,
Yeah.
all charter schools are public schools. All charter
Not,
schools.
yeah, some are in.
That's
No, but,
what Bill
so
Gates
let me ask you a
wants.
question. I don't want to get into a conversation about pro or anti-charters, but all charter schools are public schools. And is it not correct that all charter schools receive funds from the state, from the local school district?
All public schools receive money.
Never mind. End story.
I certainly don't want to be antagonistic. I'm only trying to advocate for children. That's really what I do every day.
Yeah, this is not a.
I teach children.
Well, we
and I
just-
teach
we
because
had
of
a-
parents.
Yeah, I just want to hear from,
We just, that's all I was trying to say.
yes, go ahead.
Okay, my name is Fallon Davis, and I'm a nonprofit founder and owner, Steam Urban. We are a vendor to public and charter schools. We serve black and brown students primarily, like across the board. But what I see in the talks around STEM, because I advocate for STEAM, and I'm working towards changing the narrative. Black and brown students need to feel alive again, and so the arts included with STEM is, to me, a resolution to getting them interested in STEM, because STEM has been so placed far away from us as a people that sometimes students, a lot of times, are even telling me, I'm not doing that because I don't want to get into that mix. And so, and the opposite of that is they love science, they love math, they love learning, but they don't feel good around learning because it's so systemic. You know, it's like you have to be a doctor to enjoy STEM, or you have to be the things that they feel like they can't be. And so advocating for STEAM is my resolution to changing, especially with black and brown communities, to changing students' outlook on these career paths across the board. Because there are careers that aren't looked at as viable when we just say STEM, like being a farmer or being an agriculturalist, you know what I mean? That is things that they never think of because it's not kind of put into their realm.
Yeah.
So it's also expanding their mind of what a career looks like in STEAM, in this world, you know what I mean? And not pushing so much of the white agenda, the white messaging. Like, you don't have to assign to what they have told you you can be.
Right.
You can be a nonprofit founder.
Right.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? That's not even, those are some things. You can be a politician, you can be, and still love math, still love science, you know? And so advocating for the small vendors like myself, you know, who come in and talk about the real history, the real, you know, letting in different viewpoints is also kind of the resolution to this.
Yeah. And thankfully there's a workshop at some point on STEAM.
Well, I'm on
Are you running that?
I'm not doing the STEAM one, no.
Oh, okay.
I'm doing the access to arts.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'll wrap it up, but I know there are other conversations going on. I really appreciate the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.